Hello, welcome back to another episode of Soul Sessions with Deborah and Rob Maldonado, and we are finalizing our last episode in the series of the question, did your parents really screw you up? A case for and against. And have we decided?
Not yet. There's not all the evidence is in yet.
Yeah, this is the last piece of evidence to see if our family really did screw up our life. And we're poking fun at it, but it's common therapy talk about mother issues, father issues. But we're going to go deeper into that today because we're going to talk about transcending your family archetype. And so overall, what does that mean for you, Rob?
Yeah, so let's review where we've been. We talked about genetics in the beginning and how it has such a powerful influence, and it is considered to be about 40% of your, let's say, your behavior, your destiny in a sense. The other 40 is the environment, the school you go to, the way your socioeconomic status, the way you were parented, etc. And then there's a 20% chance.
The Vegas odds.
Yeah, it's up for grabs that things are going to happen that you can't really predict or control for. And in a way, that's what saves us, because then we're able to become ourselves, individuals. But so in thinking about archetypes, let's define first what an archetype is, based on Jung's work.
A lot of people think archetype is just like a personality type, but archetypes is a much broader a concept. And I always like to think of it as a universal pattern that in humanity and nature we all share.
It's the original idea. If you think about the universe as a mind, the universe had certain things in mind, certain ideas that then play out as behavioral patterns.
Like a template for, like the sphere is an archetype. There's this circle, and the fractal's an archetype.
Yeah.
And then there's certain archetypes that apply to animals, and then we're evolved animals. So we have human archetypes, and then there's universal, just beingness, spiritual archetypes, nature archetypes.
Yeah, and we can't see them directly. A lot of people mistake the symbol for the archetype. So they think a character, let's say a
hero, right?
Yeah, or a character in a novel or a play or a movie, that they are an archetype. But that's a symbol or a character that's related to an archetype.
So someone says villain, and they're seeing maybe the Joker, as the villain, and so he's the villain archetype, but he's not the villain archetype. He's symbolically he's a symbol of the archetype. So I love that idea that because the villain comes in many forms.
That's right.
And the villain could be your parents. The villain could be your best friend, your ex-husband. They come in all different forms, but they symbolize this underlying universal idea that we all share, that there's a villain and there's a hero and all these characters in the world.
Yeah. So a good way to think about our experience in the family is through the archetype of individuation, meaning that we want to consider ourselves individual. If you notice, the child is very dependent on the parents early on, but then wants to break away, right? Even when we crawl, we start to crawl away and to explore. So that...
make our own decisions, say no, that famous toddler, the twos, the terrible twos.
Yeah, that tendency to want to explore on our own is very early on is expressed. So the archetype is individuation for the individual. For the family, it's the family archetype, the archetype of unity, of collectiveness, of
the tribe,
of staying together. Yeah, very much. It is the cell form of society, right? That's why a lot of people talk about if the family goes, the whole society goes, because societies need that elemental structure at the beginning in order to kind of socialize us to that idea that, yeah, we're all in this together.
So there's an archetype in family. And I just want to say before we get into this, we often get questions about feminine, masculine, and the duality. And this has nothing to do with a sexual role, that you're playing. It's really an archetypal role when we talk about mother, father, child. So two women, one could play the father archetype and one can play the mother. It doesn't necessarily mean that person, just to kind of lay that out there. So I know people ask that question a lot when we talk about mother, father, or duality, or feminine, masculine.
Yeah, and this is by no means comprehensive because family is a huge topic. It's its own kind of branch of psychology. So we're just looking at it from the point of view of individuation, meaning our tendency and our need to become our true selves.
And so it's a structural organization that our ego finds comfort in. It's like almost like a paved road that we all live into, and then we want to go off-road eventually, but we often are in this paved road of these archetypes. We kind of naturally are inclined, like for a woman naturally inclines that mother role, and sometimes mostly the man goes on that paved road that's from previous generation. And then don't you think too, we talked about this genetically, that we have like social structures and our bodies are different, so we process emotions differently, all those things. So when we talk about the family archetype and how it's expressed itself, what would you say what is that structure of a family?
Yeah, so in the family, and here we see the principle, right, that the archetype plays out very differently in different environments. So you see different cultures expressing the same archetype of the family in very different ways. So in some cultures, it's permissible to spank the children. In others, it is not. In some cultures, mating and getting together is done through the internet, through dating,
or through your parents.
apps, and in others, the parents decide who you're going to marry because it's a family structure, and you're marrying into families and those things. So
and in some families, it's a woman is expected to get married and have children, and if they don't and they want to pursue a career, it feels like, wait a minute, that's not part of the plan. We have the paved road here. Stay in the road versus go off the road and be yourself. You do what we've always done. Lead this, and it's like you say, we're so conditioned in it, we don't even realize we're in that pattern, or the pressure feels like it's coming from externally, but it's really an internal tendency to stay on the paved road from the ego's perspective.
Absolutely. And now there's blended families, non-traditional families where you might have two women, two guys raising kids, and that's all fine. They're expressing the same archetypal pattern just in their unique way. Yeah. So we see that families come in all kinds of different ways. There is no right or wrong way to do it.
And not even biologically. You see some people, like a woman gets divorced and then her brother becomes the father. If the father passes away when the children are young.
Well, you're talking Freudian stuff now. But
But I mean, there's someone who always has that father role. That's what I'm just saying, that kind of there's a default that someone needs to be the father in this unit. And so the older brother sometimes becomes the father figure. And that's, okay, we won't talk about the Freudian part of that, but it is, I'm just saying that there's the mother, father, child, that dynamic seems to be unspoken and almost like by default just kind of forms. Archetypally falls into that pattern. Right. Like we don't think, someone has to take the father role. It just kind of happens instinctually.
Yeah, absolutely. And people that don't have kids, then they often mentor or are parental figures or mother figures to younger people.
Or they could be mothering to their spouse.
Another Freudian slip.
Okay.
We should do a Freudian.
I should have been a Freudian coach.
Yeah, a Freudian program.
Yeah, but but just those three roles, like how they mix around. And then I also want to throw out that in a corporate setting, there's in a team, you'll see the father, the mother, and the child in the team as well, like that dynamic. And it's a dynamic. It means that there's an interaction. It's not just someone's
static.
deciding that's the static, obviously, but not that someone is just in like isolated and they're that way. It's the interaction between you and that person and your side and their side that's what dynamic is. So maybe we could talk just a tiny bit about psychodynamics and what that means, so we can continue the conversation.
Really, let's say the kernel, what distinguishes psychodynamic models is this idea that everything is happening in our psyche, in a sense, that our psyche contains all these elements in our mind, and that they are actively jostling for position within the individual. And that's a very different psychology than the cognitive behavioral models, where no, the individual is considered to be making choices and doing these things externally. Behavior is observed. And
then the external people are making their own decisions that are independent of that person.
Yeah.
And then you have to keep boundaries and you have to communicate all those ideas of communication, your needs, and make kind of projecting onto your stuff on. You don't realize that you're projecting.
In psychodynamic models, yeah.
Yeah, but in cognitive behavioral, they don't really talk about.
Oh, they don't even acknowledge those things. So yeah,
we
that's
think
not
that
part of it.
There's like an independent reality outside of the mind. Like the mind is encased in the brain, and it's like a very like you're just separate from everyone. And then in psychodynamic model, it's that we're connected to everyone. It's more of a spiritual model in a way.
Yeah.
Some way, some elements, like Jungian is more different.
It's closer, because it does, let's say, it did come out of philosophy. And so it includes a lot of philosophical concepts that aren't accepted in more scientifically based models. But it's a useful way to understand the family, because in family there's such a rich psychology going on. When I was training in clinical psychology, I thought family psychology is probably the boring part of psychology until I did family therapy and I saw that, oh my God, there's so much going on here, because you're seeing human beings in their true environment. No one is an individual. No one is an island. No one is born just by themselves.
And don't you find that most people, we've coached thousands of people over the past 10 years or more, 20 years, and almost every person, like you can't like interact with someone as a coach or a therapist without them mentioning their parents. It always seems to be the main kind of sticking point for them, some resentment or some adoration they're trying to get from the parent, that entanglement. And the children too, the mother, we working with mothers. So this kind of core, it shapes us when we're so young that we don't realize that we're being conditioned, and then it replicates throughout our life.
Well, there's a double whammy there, because you're getting genes from the parents, meaning your inheritance as far as the way you're going to look and your intelligence and all that is coming. 40% of it at least is coming from the genes, and then you're observing them and they're teaching you, and you're learning language from them, you're learning problem solving skills, all these incredible things very early on from your parents.
And don't we look at them as children, as gods, like they're because they're really like the king and queen, they're in charge of our livelihood and safety. Like as children, we couldn't just leave. We all did, like when we were like 7 or 8, packed our suitcases. I'm gonna run away, kind of thing. But we never do. Like I went to the end of my block once, and my mother just stood there and waited for me to come back. But we needed. That was a funny story. I still remember that to this day. But it is that kind of, we can't let go. And then as adults, we have the same thing. We love our parents, but we can't let go. It's such a powerful experience. So our first experience of the world.
Yes, and we know the mother is considered the primary relationship, the first one that we have, and the one that imprints deepest in us, because she is our world basically and our universe. She protects us, feeds us, changes us, makes us comfortable. And so that early experience is very powerful and ingrains or imprints in us powerfully, and we carry it with us for the rest of our lives.
And we spend the beginning, the very first sense of our awareness was in her body. I mean, we were basically physically living inside her body. So that connection, that feeling her emotions. And I think we learn, I don't know what the studies are, but I feel that we learn a lot just from being in another human being, like what you have a sense of what's happening. Yeah. And what's, kind of the emotions and all those things that happen inside.
So when we talk at the archetypal level, the mother archetype, an really important archetype being Jungian psychology. And we look at the mother, our physical mother, our biological mother, or our adopted mother in this way.
Or a nanny even, right?
Yeah, as a symbol, as someone who takes care of us and nurtures us, and kind of we are related to in this emotional, genetic, and in every way, biological way. Now the symbol then, and remember the symbol is not the archetype, but it's a powerful representation of the archetype. So we can say that our individual mothers are symbols of this larger universal archetype of mother.
Beyond just a person, like a character. It's the world.
Yes, so the archetype itself represents nature, the material world. Matter itself, the word matter comes from the word mother. It is the primal matter that creates our life, including our bodies, the physical comforts of the universe, our sensory experiences in the world. So that's a powerful connection there with the archetype, that through the symbol of our individual mothers, we connect to the universal mother, which is matter. So everything in the world we start to read as our early experiences, meaning if our mother was nurturing and caring, and most mothers are, and here this is an important point, that we're talking about, let's say, typical experiences, not the extremes, because often people ask, what about people that were abandoned and raised by wolves or something? Well,
or abused, or
those are extreme cases. In general, we're talking about most people experience a caring, loving, nurturing mother,
and even a critical mother every once in a while, but or like
but isn't that part of mothering, though, to protect you from doing crazy things, which as a child
don't make the same mistakes I did.
Yes, as a child you tend to do. So that connection and that early experience from different models cut it off at different points, but I'd say the first 6 years of your life are so crucial, because you are in that psychological, emotional bubble of the mother.
So a lot of kids, preschool is probably, I don't know if there's research because we didn't have preschool in the 60s and 70s when I grew up. So a lot of, we just went right to kindergarten. But I remember that feeling of, I'm not going to be with my mom I'm going to this strange place. There's a lot of kids that cry the first day of kindergarten. So there's that separation. But in preschool, they're separated earlier. And a lot of times when mother's working and they have a caretaker. So is there like research on a caretaker versus the mother staying longer with the child? Is there any research on that?
Yeah, there was a large study with the Head Start. Head Start was it was a government program that was in place for a while. And it brought in kids very early on, like a pre-kinder and around kindergarten age, I think, and kind of started educating them early on. And they followed some of those kids throughout their lives, and sure enough, it had a big impact. It helped them in academic work.
Become more independent, or yeah.
And do better in school and all those
So
things.
what sometimes we think is the cruel thing, if you're feeling like separated from the mother, is actually gives us strength. And so we get kind of a mother who hovers and like doesn't want to homeschool the child that child may have a different experience. So it's not like, and we talked about this in the last episode of parenting styles. So if you missed that, go back and watch the last episode. But yeah, so the mother really, and like think about your parenting experience. Did your mother, was she there all the time for you? Do you expect and how does that relate to the world? Like, what was that relationship like? Very young, like you said, under 6. We're not talking about what your relationship with your mother is now, but how she was when you were younger.
Not only that, how you interpret it.
Yes.
Because two kids can be born in the same household, very close together, and interpret their experience with their mother very differently.
Like I had a stay-at-home mom, and so she was always there. I always felt safe. And I wonder, kids that had the latchkey kids, they kind of feel, a little more isolated. But I guess, again, it doesn't matter. Either way, what you interpret that as. It could be like she's too much.
Exactly. Yeah, some kids would interpret that as she's always on my case. She's hovering, always kind of knowing what I'm doing.
Claustrophobic. Right?
Yes, and others would say that was great. My mom was always there for me, that kind of stuff.
And is that why we love nature so much? The kind of looking at nature because it's our mother. And we hear Mother Earth, right? Mother Nature, that idea of feeling like our home. And so it's that basically, like they think about being in the womb, it's our womb of life, that's kind of beautiful, safe place. And then we want to stay there. We want to stay connected into that safety. So let's go on to have anything
just one last thing from the point of view of individuation, especially if you're a man, you have to rebel against the mother. You have to find a way to become independent from the mother. And of course,
what would be the purpose of that? Just to get your masculinity?
That's right, because you have to find and establish your identity as a man, independent of that emotional bubble of the mother. And often in some primitive and ancient cultures, you see that at a certain point, around 7 or so, the child was kidnapped by the men and taken to the camp of the men where he was tested. Maybe the Spartans or something like that in the West, but in some South American cultures or African cultures, they still kind of do this process of isolating the child from the mother.
Well, it's sort of when we were maybe 100 years ago, World War I, World War II, a lot of these boys, they were just out of high school. They didn't even go to college, and they were living with their mother, and they had to go off to war. So that happened in Western culture as well.
Yeah, that's not a good way to get initiated. But
that's what happened. Yeah. It's like it made, and you always see those army shows where like, oh, you're still a mama's boy, and there's some people, they just didn't know how to, and you have to build that camaraderie, the brotherhood, that type of thing.
A lot of that is done now through peers. So the peer group then serves as an initiation. Yeah, a kind of...
The bromance.
Redefining yourself outside of the family role. And for a man or a boy, it's outside of the circle of the mother. For women, of course, it's a separate path, but very similar, that they have to find their identification, their identity through that self-realization somehow. But
Jung says if you reject the mother completely, you're actually cutting off yourself from the archetype in a way, that kind of unconsciously cutting yourself off from expressing the creativity and nurturing and the femininity. Sometimes if you have resentment or you just want to push them away, he said it's really hard for a woman. Like a woman can let go of the father easily because she's not a male, but she really needs to integrate her feminine power and individuate from the mother, but not reject the mother. So the difference between rejection and individuation is that the woman accepts the mother for who she is, knowing that it's not personal, but doesn't need to push her away, and understand maybe that, maybe she's like that because grandma was like that and her grandmother was like that and she was stuck in a pattern. Not to get her off the hook if she was, cruel, but to understand on a deeper way that it wasn't personal. Like, she didn't intend to harm you. Most of the time it's very unconscious. And that individuation is maturing into that, not resenting her your whole life, because when you push someone away and you resent them, it ends up, you're giving that part of you, that part power, and then you're creating a persona that's the opposite.
Yeah, and that's probably due to the lack of cultural institutions and rituals that would serve that function of having people individuate in a more naturally and socially acceptable way, so that people then have to reject the parents in order to individuate. And that's not let's say it's not the best way to do it. So
as long as you resent your mother, that's the ego, and it's controlling your life. And we often think, well, if I let go of the resentment, then I made what she did right. But if you let go of the resentment, you just free yourself. It's like you're stop holding on to the past, and now you're free to create your own way, versus I'm going to create the opposite of what she did, and you're still caught up in her having power over you. So let's go to the father, because I have some interesting things to say about this. But the father is like a representative of the king, and a lot of times I'm the king of the house, I'm the leader of the house.
Because the archetype of the father, well, that's the archetype of the father, the king, the rule giver, the protector, the spiritual element in life. And in society, then, because the material experience of the world is the mother, then it's the actions that we take in society that represent the father element.
The active force.
The active force, the ability to create businesses, to go out into the world and make changes.
And so with men, they have to become their own men, not only separate from the mother, but also kind of create their own identity. And again, not resent the father, or, there's some people that, my father was a lawyer, my grandfather's a lawyer, I'm going to be a lawyer, and we all work in the same law firm, and my son's going to be a lawyer, or the family business. And it's almost like that person, well, it is that the person doesn't individuate. They're not free to have an individual expression. They're just carrying on the pattern. Not that it's bad, but they're not free. It's not a choice.
Yeah, it can be. But individuation is a psychological process. So they can become a lawyer and still individuate, but they have to undergo that internal process.
But they have to make it a choice versus I have to do it, or it's expected of me. And a lot of times the father's expectations of the son, the son sometimes can rebel. You see this in these like very wealthy fathers, and their son just wants to that movie, All the Money in the World, where the son was just kind of just want to be a hippie and didn't care. And he was really trying to, and he disowned his son even from it. And that's an extreme case. I mean, not an everyday case, but that idea that the son can choose to either be like the father or reject the father. But either way, they're not free because they're still responding to the conditioning.
I don't remember that movie that well, but it was a rich father, right? Some kind of tycoon from a business, a big business.
Yeah, he owned the museums in L.A. I can't think of his name now, but all the money.
Getty,
yeah.
The Getty.
And he was like one of the richest men in the world, and his son
got kidnapped.
But his son was kind of like this artistic, didn't want to be involved in all the businesses, and just kind of wanted to live like a hippie life. And then he got kidnapped, and the father didn't even want to pay for him, to get rescued. It was kind of an interesting story.
You can keep him.
Yeah, you can keep him, but it was like that. And then he realized he had to get him back. But even all the money in the world doesn't build that. That money doesn't make you happy. That was the theme of it.
Often it interferes in that process then, because the values are different.
And even if you're a man, and I've worked with a lot of men who had their fathers had high expectations of them, and even if it's not spoken, the child internalizes it. Like the son will internalize it. Even the father might not even say, "I want you to be successful," but they'll make a comment of, "Hey, how is your business going?" And then internally, the son would be like, "Oh, he's always on my case. He's, seeing if I'm successful yet." But it's almost like you said, an internal experience that we're having of projecting onto the father, that our father, that they have such expectations of us. So we have to look at that too. Is it, what are they really saying? So we hear their words, and then our internal processing of that is from that expectation or the perception that we put on the father at a young age.
Yeah. And so half the world is the mother and half the world is the father.
Now let's talk about the daughter and the father.
Yeah, different dynamics, right? Because the daughter-father relationship kind of gives the daughter the imprint of what a relationship is from the observation from the relationship with the parents or in between the parents, right? How does the father treat the mother? And it would depend, again, it would be very individualized, because it would depend if the daughter identifies with the mother or not. Because we know some women identify more with the father. And that has to do with the persona building, how they build their persona. Do they identify more with the mother or with the father? And then what is the relationship between the two? So it gives the woman an imprint as to how they're going to play out relationships.
So if a woman feels that the father's very controlling and doesn't want to be controlled by a man, she unconscious, and could be very, very unconscious, that she'll find the men that are unavailable because she doesn't want to be controlled. So that's really her deepest kind of idea, the desire that she has, is to remain independent. And so they consciously want a relationship, but they end up rejecting or finding people that are the opposite of their father, and then run away from people that want to be with her because she doesn't want that control. Like that's one example. But also I want to talk about too, the men and for a relationship with the man and his mother as well, because the mother, he will project his mother onto the woman. And so everything the mother wasn't for the man, guess what? His partner is going to be reflecting that.
Absolutely.
And the person is like, where did you get that from? Why does he have seeing like a distorted image of their partner or someone they're dating?
Yeah, expectations have a lot to do with it, and projection, of course. And relationships, especially romantic relationships, are so easy to project onto the partner what is the individual's shadow, meaning what they have repressed about their family experience, then it's projected onto the partner.
I saw about 20 years ago, there was a movie with Bruce Willis, and it was called The Story of Us. Do you remember that movie? And there was a scene where they're in bed together, and they're kind of trying to decide if they're going to get divorced or not. And then both of their parents are on each side of them in bed with them and talking and interfering in their conversations. And it was really a good visual of how much it's not just between these two people. It's all that conditioning that we bring into a relationship. So yeah, so families, very, very powerful. So let's go to the child archetype.
Yes, so
the mother, the father, and the child.
The child archetype then represents potential, new life, new possibility. That's why, when there's a baby in the room or a small kid, everyone feels happy and joyful because it is...
Unless the baby's crying and you're on an airplane.
Right. But it is that potential, the human potential that now is given life and opportunity. So that's a lot to fulfill, right? But as adults and parents project that possibility onto the child, right? They feel that joy of new life, new possibility, of kind of another chance of living a life through the child. So the mother, the father, and the child complete that kind of nuclear family paradigm of the divine family.
So what you're saying is that the child projects on the mother and father, this divine, you're going to take care of me. And then the parents project onto the child, you're going to live out all my unfulfilled parts of my life, and I'm going to work through my mistakes through you. You're going to be what I couldn't do.
Yes. I mean, I see that a lot. The ideal would be that the parents understand that this child is meant to grow up and become his own or her own person, right? But a lot of parents don't. They're not that enlightened or that knowledgeable. And so, yeah, that projection of they're going to fulfill my unlived life.
But I think also, too, the triad of the mother, father, child, there's a love there and a bond that you can't deny. So that's an unspoken bond. And so no matter how much, we heard in Buddhism, the hate and love are basically two sides of the same coin. That we care, there's a caring, there are blood, and so it's really hard to fully extricate ourselves from that triad, and so it's natural for us to, even if we had a difficult time with our parents, to want to be connected to them still. And then also the mother and the child sometimes is that, or the father and the child, there's that kind of need to stay in touch. Not every time. There's people that abandon their children and aren't kind of in touch with themselves. But from a positive standpoint, it's really a nice thing to think about, is that there's this powerful bond of love that is beyond the ego, that is formed in those early life stages. And so that's why it's so difficult for us to leave.
Yeah, there's that strong psychic connection with the parents, especially with the mother.
And because we're genetically similar, isn't there a need to stay with people, almost we have an affinity with them, so we have to stay connected to them in some way, even if we don't enjoy them all the time?
Yeah. And psychologically, we know that this happens. We internalize our parents, meaning they don't even have to be around us any longer for us to hear their voice, to feel their presence in a sense, and to act in accordance to their wishes or against their wishes, which is the old paradigm of I either identify with my parents or where I reject them. But either way, we're caught. The only real freedom from that, and not about rejecting them, but it's transcendence, meaning real individuation, where we find our own identity and establish our own selves in the world, independent of our parents. Then we can make real decisions.
I think the biggest lesson a lot of our clients hear is that when you accept the parent for who they are, or what their conditioning, it's instead of trying to get them to change, it's so much easier because, okay, they don't have the capability, or maybe they're, depressed, or they were going through a tough time. They had 12 kids to take care of when I was young. To accept that, okay, they weren't perfect, and stop, again, relitigating your childhoods, and just accept that that's who they were. And now you can let go. Now you can say, not saying it's right or wrong, but accept that you can't change that. You're not change. You can't change it. It happened. And then a lot of times too, you had said, which I find it really breakthrough for me, is that parent that you had when you were a kid and under 6 no longer exist, because they're not 30 or 25-year-old person anymore. They're maybe 50 or 60 or 70. They're a different person. They lived a whole life after you left and went to high school and went to college. They evolved in ways and maybe became softer and more self-aware. So that person that you're trying to relate to as a child is not really there anymore. It's an idea in your mind.
Very much so. And that is a big part of psychodynamic theory right there. That you're really fighting your own demons from within, and your own angels as well, or accepting your own angels. It's your mind that you're working with, the psychodynamics of your own psyche. So
we can use the child archetype. A lot of people have dreams about the child. It's it's this idea, this newness. So it's almost as if when we hit that midlife, as Jung says, that 30s, where we're really ready to step in and individuate, we've built up the ego enough. It's almost as if we have to become a child again, in a way of being open, exploring like we did, where we're just discovering again. And wouldn't you say it's kind of like a rebirth that's happening? And that's an archetype as well, that rebirth into, we needed those structures to survive in the world. You said in the last episode, it's a biological survival and then a social survival. And we needed those things. They weren't perfect, but we needed them. We're survived, we're alive. And so now it's time for us to be reborn into our true self. And that's the process. So we don't want to resent the past because it actually got us here. What we want to do is use whatever obstacles that the past has given us and conditioned us to be to free our mind.
That's it. Because anything we resent, anything we resist will persist, meaning we're giving it power by pushing it away, by rejecting it. What you want to do is realize, again, that there's no need to hold on to resentment because people were not acting out of free will. They were acting out of conditioning, out of social norms, out of stress, pressures, whatever it was. It's not a real choice that they're making. They're acting out of that conditioning.
So with the child archetype, it's about removing the veil and seeing beyond the senses, what we're seeing, what we're feeling, what we're experiencing in the physical world, the material world, and think, well, what's possible outside of this? And even the self-concept is really hooked into our conditioning. Our self-concept is not really our free choice to be who we are going to be. A lot of times we think, oh, I'm going to be this person, but it's based on rejecting another part of ourselves. So it's about that fresh, non-conditional, new creation in our life versus I'm doing this so I can get away from that. I'm going to be successful so I can get away from failure. I'm going to find a relationship so I can get away from being lonely or abandoned. And then I also think, too, there's a lot of this masculine, feminine stuff around. And we do.
What do you mean by that?
Well, just kind of this idea of this patriarchy, this, a lot of times women empowerment, which I know the world is showing itself. It's over centuries of being in this as human beings. Men have always been in power, but we can't change it by resenting the men, because they're just falling into the archetype. We don't want to let them get away with it, but it's like we agreed to it on some level as, the role that we're playing. So how do we approach this dynamic between masculine and feminine where we're not fighting and being like men are bad, they're, pushing them away, or we need to fight, and like they're almost like have an agenda against us in a way. And for men too, I think if they feel like women aren't a threat as well, that we can't give women too much power. So it's the same, almost like we're acting out that triad in our life as adults with just the male and female roles that we play and all that.
Yeah.
On a kind of a social empowering women. You can't empower yourself as a woman by rejecting the masculine, because then you're rejecting your own masculine power, your own will, your own active force.
Yeah, that's a good way to see it. Well, if you consider society is made up of individuals, and individuals have these complexes, right? Let's say of rejecting the mother complex, or a negative mother complex, as Jung would call it. Then you see the destruction of nature as a result of that collective force acting in the world. That we don't respect nature. We don't see it as valuable. We don't see it as something living and that we're a part of.
Our Earth is our mother. And actually Earth Day is coming up in a couple of days. So.
And the rejection of the father then is seen as rejecting spirituality. The things we can't see. So we become, or modern human beings, like Jung says, become very materialistic in the sense that I'm only going to believe and function and focus on what I can sense with my senses, what I can observe and see, and that leaves up half of what's possible for us as human beings, because we can't see love, we can't see morality, we can't see spirituality, yet we know it's an important part of our human experience.
One of my a colleague of mine, when I worked in the yoga company I worked in a couple of years ago, 30 years ago, he gave a talk, and he was talking about the birth of his child. And I never heard this before, but he said that, he was there with his wife and the baby's being born. And he said the first thought he had when that baby came out of the womb was possibility. And I got goosebumps from that. But that's really that kind of like idea. Imagine that you welcome anything new in your life as this is pure possibility. So instead of looking at the material world and saying, let's rearrange the furniture, let's put all the women in power and let's shame the men, or put the women in their place by limiting their rights so we can stay in control. What if we thought of a new possibility where the other person isn't the enemy, but how do we integrate and how to rise above our materialistic and the way things have been to something fresh and new, where men and women can live together in harmony. I don't know, but you know what I'm saying? It's like this this idea that we're fighting something, but it's really within ourselves.
But that's precisely the usefulness of this kind of knowledge, that it gives us a deeper understanding of the psyche. If, like the Buddha said, if you don't understand your mind, if your mind is not disciplined, it can hurt you more than your worst enemy. But if, on the contrary, if you understand the mind and you can discipline it, you can train it, and you can wield it, then it becomes your best friend. And it gives you more than even your parents can give you, because it allows you to see things in this clearer way.
So anytime there's an obstacle in your life, say, why is my mind creating this? Why is my mind creating the conditions for this obstacle? And if you examine it, you realize that you're making a lot of assumptions of what that other person means, what they're feeling, what a situation means. So you get in a car accident and you think, this is terrible, this is bad. You find this great person online and you think this is great, but then that person could break your heart next week. So we're always making these very quick assumptions based on the past. And to be free is to be like a child and be this curious about what's showing up, and not always looking at things as black and white, negative, positive. I have to think positive all the time, or I'm thinking negative, I'm going to attract negative things. It's more about how can I be curious about my assumptions of what I'm seeing and free my mind from past assumptions, past conditioning, to see the opportunity that's right in front of me with this situation.
One last element about the family archetype, that it is meant to come together, to be unified, and to engender this new life, but it is also meant to be dissolved, to be dismantled in a sense, because the child is meant to go off and start their own family, start their own life, and the parents then have to let go. And often
that's hard for parents. They want to be involved.
Yeah. When that letting go is natural and healthy, then there is that sense of completeness. When it's not, when people haven't resolved all their issues, when they're still hanging on to resentments or anger, or even too attached to their past family conditions, there isn't that ability to go off and create this new life. Then that's not a healthy system. That's not a good way to experience the family.
So the mother, father, child is within us. We are the mother to ourselves, how we nurture and care for ourselves, how we help us feel safe. The father archetype is in us to make action and will and move us in the world. And then the child is that magical expression. So the dark side of the child would be more of a helpless victim and needing the world to take care of me. And the magical child is like that one that wants to explore, the one that doesn't cry when it goes to kindergarten and says, oh, great, this is going to be a great time. I'm going to get to do something new. And so when you look at your life and where you're stuck, just think of those three elements within yourself. And a father's the spirit, the mother's the material, the body is the mother. Do you take care of your body? Do you nurture your body, or do you put bad stuff in your body? Do you abuse your body and you do not work out? Do you let it go? And are you over-identified with the body and have no spiritual connection? So all those things. So yeah, this is a great way to round it up. And so what's the verdict, Rod?
The verdict
did our parents screw us up? A case for and against? What is your final verdict?
I'd say 40%.
40%
of the fault lies with the parents because of the genetic inheritance.
You can't control that.
Yeah, but most of it. So if you count the environment, which as adults, essentially we have control over our environment. That's 40%, and then 20% of chance. That's already 60%, meaning the majority of the responsibility lies with us, that we are responsible for our destiny, for our lives.
And when we take responsibility, we're that child that says, I'm not what happened to me.
Yeah.
I'm free to choose who I become, Carl Jung. It's you really get to choose. All right. We'll see you next week on the Soul Sessions. If you have not subscribe to us on YouTube, make sure you sign up here. And if you are listening to our podcast on one of the podcasts, Spotify or iTunes or all the plethora of podcast listening tools that you have, be sure to subscribe too. We have a fresh episode every week, and we wish you the best, and we'll see you next time.
Stay well.
Bye-bye.